ChatGPT 3 or ChatGPT 4, it's extremely frightening to me.
In his book Curation, Michael Bhaskar proposed the idea that the 21st century will be the age of curation. In 2016, when his book was published, curator was a buzzword, originally meaning a person in charge of a department of a museum or a gallery or other place where objects of art are displayed. Later, that word was used to describe all sorts of activities that imply the selection of something. One can curate a page on social media, a coffee shop, or even one can curate an identity. Streaming services like Netflix also applied the model of curation. When you go on any streaming service, you see a limited collection of movies and programs which are constantly adjusting with the help of algorithm in accordance to your past preferences. In the sea of excessive media, someone already made a selection and take on the burden of choice. But as a consequence, the algorithmic mode of selection eliminates complexities by limiting people to categories, which leads to further polarization between various groups. So curation in the age of the internet isn't fully autonomous or willful or well-informed act. Now curation is the job of algorithmic media that master each day its ability to read our desire and curate it back to us. But what do we desire? One of the greatest discoveries of psychoanalysis was the criticism of rational choice theory. In Western philosophy, for a long time, there was this idea that by using rational thinking, individuals would inevitably learn what is best for them and society in general. In a way, early advertising was guided by the same principle. To sell a product means to show its functional advantages. However, later, as Neil Postman wrote in his 1980s book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, advertisers don't need to know what is right about the product, but to know what is wrong about the buyer. Sigmund Freud and many of his followers have pointed out that human beings don't always act in their interest, even when they know what it is. Psychoanalysts draw attention to the sphere of the unconscious to show the complexities of human desire. According to Freud's theory, the human psyche is fractured into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id means raw instincts that develop in the early stages of life. A superego is, well, a very rough explanation of it will be culture. It is our upbringing, ideals, and ethical norms. And lastly, the ego. Well, it is a more or less conscious side of our psyche. Okay, it's not that simple, but for now it will serve us. Apart from treating his patients, Freud was interested in applying his theory to a broader context, for instance to group psychology or crowd psychology. And he was not the only one interested in this field. In 1929, a young public relations counselor named Edward Bernays was hired by the American Tobacco Company to boost sales of the Lucky Strike cigarettes. The company was successful at selling cigarettes to men, but women did not smoke much, and the ones who smoked were considered immoral social outcasts. Edward Bernays took the challenge and forever changed the field of advertising and marketing. So, if you would be in the position of Bernays, how would you advertise cigarettes? Well, the first and the most instinctive way is to make it more attractive by making ads with seductive and stylish women that smoke, especially if they are popular figures. And he did that. But if that was it, Edward Bernays would not be considered a father of public relations, wouldn't he? I did not mention that Edward Bernays' uncle was none other than Sigmund Freud, and Bernays believed that the implementation of psychoanalytic discoveries into marketing is a promising strategy. To effectively work with the sphere of the human unconscious, one should sell values rather than products. In 1929, a woman named Bertha Hunt published a telegram. In the interest of equality of the sexes and to fight another sex taboo, I and other young women will light another torch of freedom by smoking cigarettes while strolling on Fifth Avenue Easter Sunday. Hunt and several other women publicly smoked Lucky Strike cigarettes during the Easter parade in New York, which drew a lot of media attention. In her later interviews, Hunt would claim that she first got the idea for this campaign when a man with her in the street asked her to extinguish her cigarette as it embarrassed him. Hunt did not mention that this whole campaign was a stunt initiated by Bernays and paid for by Lucky Strike. But the effect of the campaign was impressive. Sales doubled in the following year. Bernays understood the power of unconscious. This was a campaign that was not for everyone, but it nevertheless found its audience. This campaign made smoking seem a form of liberation for women who craved it, a chance to express their newfound strength and freedom. Marketing that works not just on an aesthetic level, but on an axiological level is very effective, and I don't think we are immune to this even nowadays. There is a very good essay by TLP where he critically analyzes the Dove Beauty sketch ad, the link to which I'm going to put in the description for this video. I just want to mention this essay because in it, TLP points to this contradiction of us being so used to ads making some social criticism that we no longer can make powerful messages about, for instance, beauty standards on our own. Instead, we would share a Dove Beauty sketch ad on Facebook, an ad that criticizes insecurity about our appearance, but it is still an ad made by a beauty brand. If in the times of Edward Bernays, no technology would provide one with instant access to big data on the wishes and demands of different individuals, now the access to big data gives more possibilities. So we have the Bernaysian methodology of targeting different groups, but on steroids. It manifests in all sorts of things, in how social media feeds do not look the same for everyone, in how there is a label for any niche aesthetic, and in how identities are being built on consuming certain goods and not the other way around. As documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis puts it, we as individuals are trapped within ourselves. Or it's probably better to use the Deleuzian term, individuals rather than individuals. Individuals who are trapped in echo chambers of our own desires. I would not say that all media nowadays lead to the state of individualism, but I would argue that there are certain elements of it that encourage antisocial behavior.
As an individual,
My individuality represented. This is who I am.
what's waiting for me.
What capitalism managed to do that was brilliant was to actually create products that people like me would be interested in. Capitalism developed a whole industry at developing products that evoked a larger sense of self, that seemed to agree with us that the self was infinite, that you could be anything you wanted to be, that took our philosophy and agreed with it, and then created products that supposedly helped you, aids, that helped you be this limitless self. The product sells you a way of life, a way of being. The product sells you values.
Well, what I wear is a statement.
In his book Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher describes how capitalism constantly adjusts to new circumstances and neutralizes its criticism. He adheres to Deleuze, Guattari, and Zizek in admitting that the nature of capitalism is to constantly adapt. Fisher even compares capitalism to a carpenter's thing. Everything can be commodified: our desires, insecurities, political views, boredom, depression, the discourse. Even the criticism of capitalism is commodified. This brings us to the notion that a postmodern subject, regardless of the seeming access to all sorts of information and entertainment, is not liberated, but rather conditioned to cynically accept control as an exchange for some small dose of enjoyment. The most famous dystopias of the 20th century, George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, represent two methods of controlling individuals. In 1984, people are controlled by pain and constant fear in a disciplinary society, where people behave under the imaginative gaze of Big Brother. It is a bleak and boring panopticon-like condition. In disciplinary society, and here I refer to Foucault's body of work, we have a worker-prisoner figure. Brave New World, on the other hand, presents a society controlled by imposed pleasure, enjoyment, and constant entertainment. In this context, one can revoke Gilles Deleuze and his society of control, in which the individual is not a prisoner but an addict. In his short essay Postscript on the Societies of Control, Deleuze prophetically describes how new technology and the cancellation of prohibitions won't free us, but rather create a new condition of control through the combination of surveillance and enjoyment. A nightmarish, schizoid, and manic condition in which a person is tethered to anything new that gives instant gratification. In Amusing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman also registered the dystopian vision of Brave New World as a prophecy. He even predicts how access to big data will be exploited by media organizations in the name of better understanding people's needs, but in reality that would not help individuals in solving their problems. I mean, this is no new. I'm sure we are all aware of how addiction works and how modern technology is used to hook us on a new app or a new discourse. The problem in the modern age is that enjoyment itself becomes subverted. The psychoanalytic notion of enjoyment presupposes that there is a limit, some prohibition that is necessary for us to enjoy something. But when the limit disappears, it does not change our drive towards the limit. As a result, there is always this strange feeling that is hard to describe. In capitalist realism, Mark Fisher named the current state of postmodern culture as depressive hedonia, a sense of something is missing, but the only way we feel we can find access to that is through enjoyment. Depressive hedonia is the result of disillusionment with the current state of affairs and also its acceptance. A lot of philosophers, including Fisher, Peter Sloterdijk, and Slavoj Žižek, also refer to the current postmodern condition as a cynical one. What they mean by cynicism is a post-enlightenment, modernized, disillusioned, unhappy consciousness. It is when a person does know that something is off, but still indulges in the same behavior pattern, while trying to maintain the image of a cold distance. When things get really bad, we just meme ourselves to oblivion, and there is no way back to how things used to be when everything was so authentic and even the smallest thing made you happy, no phones inside, and so on. But let's be real, it is not helpful to romanticize the past, especially the past that never happened. So there is no way out, or is there? Or is there? Or is there?
Or is there?
Accelerationism is a political, aesthetic, and philosophical movement that proposes pushing capitalism to its limits as the only way through capitalism. I would say that accelerationism is not a cohesive movement, but more a theoretical trend. Certain accelerationist tendencies can be found in both Marx and Nietzsche, but if we talk about the idea of accelerating the process and pushing capitalism further into flux, I think that Anti-Oedipus by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari is what comes to mind. After Deleuze and Guattari in 1990s, Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, or CCRU, a group of thinkers who worked on the cross-section of futurism, philosophy, mysticism, and science fiction, which included philosophers like Nick Land, Sadie Plant, and Mark Fisher, also elaborated on this idea of accelerating the current system to its limits. Nick Land's work, for instance, created a new form of cyber theory, in which he synthesized some Nietzschean posthuman ideas with practical posthumanism of immersion in digital technology. He also has this manifesto called Meltdown, which I recently watched. It is a mixture of electronic music and some cyberpunk poetry, I would say. It is a futuristic psychedelic experience. It is a theory that kind of wants us to embrace a cyberpunk dystopia. Land and the CCRU aimed to create visions of a dystopian future that could also speed this future up. So the idea is that we should willingly immerse ourselves in the digital realm, and it will eventually lead to the liberation from the limits of the human, to become a human algorithm hybrid. Like, what's the point of thinking about who is in control of my desires, me or an algorithm, but instead merge directly into the destructive power of the current age of instant excess and abundance. The accelerationist project has a radical logic in the process of accelerating the current system to its limits, and not in identifying the internal limit that already exists within it. It is a way of embracing the apocalypse through capitalism. I find a lot of accelerationist projects of 90s and early noughties quite exciting to engage with. I also would admit that Mark Fisher is one of my most beloved thinkers, so I cannot be objective here. Although accelerationism has some dystopian undertone, I don't necessarily see it as a call for destruction or nihilism. I view it more as an aesthetic statement, as a form of apocalyptic hedonism. But there is also another way of using accelerationist logic that also needs to be mentioned when we talk about social media. In his book Algorithmic Desire, Matthew Flisfeder tries to explore the notion of desire in the current algorithm-driven environment. He views algorithmic media as a kind of desiring machines. One of the examples to represent Flisfeder's idea here is a desire for romantic relationships, to find the other half. Flisfeder draws a lot from psychoanalysis, so buckle up, there will be a little bit of Jacques Lacan here. So Lacan has this notion of courtly love that manifests itself in pursuing an unattainable object. For example, one can obsessively desire a person insofar as she or he constantly eludes the advances. And the worst thing that can happen for the desiring subject is to obtain the object of desire, because now all the illusions are gone. It is an individual in front of you, a subject, not an object, with their own desires, wishes, and also imperfections. Keeping a distance is one of the coping mechanisms against the horrifying side of intimacy. One can remember the hedgehog's dilemma, which I made a video about. I think that courtly love can also explain the phenomena of parasocial relationships. It would seem that dating apps oppose courtly love because they allow a speedy way to meet other people. But in reality, dating apps are also the continuation of courtly love logic, because they also provide ways of mitigating anxieties that come hand in hand with intimacy. Traditional dating is limited in a spatial sense. It is more demanding and requires effort and time to pause and reflect on own feelings. And in the end, we still can be rejected. Obviously, rejection is also present on dating apps, but it mostly comes at stages when none of the parties are invested in any meaningful relationships. So in this sense, apps provide us with efficiency in the abundance of different options. So most dating apps use swiping logic, which implies that the decision is mitigated to a simple binary, swipe right or left, and algorithms will take care of everything else. Swiping eases anxieties by overcoming direct rejection. Flisfeder calls this process accelerated intimacy. The problem here is that such accelerated intimacy creates libidinal attachments to our devices and not so much to real people. Dating apps' main premise is that relationship is something that can be done effectively and productively. An interesting case of algorithmic love that Flisfeder uses is an episode from Black Mirror called Hand the DJ, where we meet two characters who, despite all life instances and algorithmic predictions that prevent them from being long-term partners, still choose to be together. But at the end of the episode, we learn that the characters themselves were really just personifications of the algorithm that now finally can show that these two individuals are in fact a perfect match. In a way, we see an accelerated intimacy at its peak, but also paradoxically, it is a showcase example of radical love. Characters don't wait for anything in return for their investment, no promise of long-term love. They are ready to make a leap of faith together and get out of the matrix, showcasing that, quote, "Love must rest not merely in passionate, even digitally mediated affairs, but in a radical trust placed in chance, to act, to choose, without any rational or efficient guarantees." Metaphorically speaking, Hand the DJ episode is an example of radical love that can take control of the algorithm. But in reality, we know that it works the other way around. As mentioned earlier, efficiency and productivity is how dating apps market themselves. But the thing is, if they were that efficient, there will be no need for them after some time. Algorithmic media encourage us to engage in a constant search for the impossible lost object. An algorithm can constantly stage and then displace desire. At the end of the book, Flisfeder makes a point that social media as such is not inherently a bad thing. In a way, its logic corresponds with certain intricacies of our psyche. Also, social media brings back lack and scarcity where would otherwise be formless abundance. However, as with every social formation, it is nevertheless split by antagonisms. We all know that social media platforms are also a place of effective discourse and polarization and also addiction. It is kind of trendy to view contemporary social media platforms as encouraging antisocial behavior. But Flisfeder argues that what makes them antisocial is the techno-capitalist logic that inserts hyper-individualism and competitiveness into the fabric of social media platforms. I'm not sure if I would completely agree with this statement, but he has a great point at the end of the book about bringing back the notion of social to social media. To do so, Flisfeder suggests not to try creating new forms of less harmful digital media, but to consider a path of transforming our culture and society more broadly. Social media potentially can give us an opportunity to go beyond the limits of our own self and our own experience, and maybe this is the way to rethink our relationships with digital technology.